Well, welcome everybody. It's a select audience for Pam's Distinguished Visitor Lecture at the University of Auckland. In fact, if you looked at the signage as you came in, you'll see, in fact, that the Distinguished Visitor Award has been upraised to the VC's Vice-Chancellor's lecture. So congratulations, Pam. You've gone from distinguished or distinction to the VC's. That's good. Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for coming. Pam, it is our great pleasure to have Pam here for 4 weeks. She's here for the month of September, being terribly distinguished. She's doing all sorts of things with our classes. She's doing readings and coming into classes. But I have to say that in the 2.5 weeks she's been here, we're doing something called Poetry as Social Action, but we've actually been doing an awful lot of weather action. We took Pam up north when she first got here, and we got straight into the path of a very big thunder and lightning storm at Matapori, which probably involves some tornadoes. Welcome to our wild weather, Pam. Next weekend, she went off to Wellington to read at the International Institute of Modern Letters, and as she began, they had a thunder and lightning storm, and they all came through it to listen to her, which was fantastic. This week, we've had another storm, but today and tomorrow, between the weather systems, we've got the good weather, and we've got Pam with us for some Poetry as Social Action. That's happening tomorrow. But tonight, it's my great pleasure to ask Pam to come and talk to us about 40 years of her poetic practice. She's called it Authentic Local. That's the title of one of her books, as most of you will be aware, and it's loaded, as Pam's titles always are. 40 years of practice, and for me, Pam Brown represents somebody who's always at the centre of the action, someone who always draws people towards her, a fantastic communicator, a wonderful networker, and in the decade or so that I've known her, it's been a huge pleasure to keep crossing and recrossing the Tasman, both physically and virtually, and thinking that in doing so, we're kind of bringing our poetries together and extending them further out into the Pacific and north and south. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Pam, and she's going to give us an hour's worth of Authentic Local.
Thank you, Michelle. Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for coming. I'd like to express my gratitude to the English Department of Auckland University for inviting me to come here to talk with students, poets, and yourselves and the staff. I'll just go straight into it. I'm not an academic, though I have been and sometimes am a teacher. I don't give lectures, nor am I a public speaker, though I've sometimes been a panellist at poetry seminars and festivals. I'll present this illustrated talk as a poet who is a novice public lecturer. I started by wondering what effect being a local might have had on my poetry writing. This led me to think that I might present a chronological record of publication covering my life in poetry and art over the last 4 decades. Publication has happened in spite of, or perhaps because of, moving around from place to place. I hope that this anecdotal slideshow will produce some kind of synthesis that might be germane to poetry writing in general. And now that it's compiled, I'm not sure that it has much to do with the topic of locality, but perhaps some useful slant will manifest. I'll mainly outline a simple history of my publications. I won't include a record of employment, nor will I cover all the political activities in which I've engaged. There won't be much analysis. I won't be reading any poetry. Mostly, I hope that you enjoy it. And this is the first and last time I'll do anything like this exposition. Susan Schultz recently called the odd feeling of visiting yourself, your past, self-tourism. And so far, I've managed to avoid autobiography or memoir, though this talk brings me in touch with it. I'm actually suspicious of self-historicisation. I love something the North American poet Charles Bernstein said in a poem: "Everyone is talking about memoir, but I just want to forget. I want a poetry that helps me to forget what I never knew. Show me the baloney and I will immerse myself in last season's mausoleums." So, on with the baloney. I've relocated many times. Since the beginning of my life in Seymour, Victoria, I've had at least 40 addresses. My childhood was an itinerant one in different Australian states. That's states as places, not states of being. And in my adult life, I've moved approximately every 4 years. Sometimes I've moved on after 3 years. Sometimes I've stayed, a year or two longer, and none of this includes my various 3 or 6 month stints in foreign countries. I don't have a notion of a home or a hometown, apart from the fact that in my adult life I've chosen Sydney as a place to return to from my interstate and foreign excursions, and as a city to relocate within. I wasn't born there and I didn't grow up there. I moved there in 1968. But what I'm getting to is that the concept local is in flux, and in my experience, it will be very difficult to claim a personal authenticity in relation to whatever point on the global positioning system I happen to be at any given time. That is, anything is authentically local in the constructed human world. Of course, authentic local flora and fauna are possible, or used to be. The title for my first collection of poems, Shore Block, came to me in a dream. Its production was an underground activity. 3 of my friends and I let ourselves in to a big commercial printery where one of us worked, at Moorabbin or Wantirna or somewhere like that in Melbourne, late at night when the printery was closed for business. We typeset, laid out, made metal plates and printed the book on the printery's discarded paper and card offcuts using whatever ink was in the big offset printing press that one of us knew how to operate. Then we collated it by hand. The next day we folded, stapled and guillotine trimmed the book in a friend's flat in Middle Park. And hey presto, my first book of poems, 24 pages, a print run of a couple of hundred. There was no author name on the cover and no biographical note, no date and no ISBN. The title page carried an anti-copyright offering. If anyone wants these poems, use them. It was dedicated to 2 North American real-life female outlaws, Catalani and Little Britches. Beneath the dedication, there was a well-known line from Antonin Artaud: "All writing is pig shit." In lowercase on the final page, it said "Poems by Pamela J.B. Brown." Obviously, the local determines the details of your politics. For instance, the US and Australia, whose military force consisted mainly of young conscripts, were engaged in an unpopular war against communism in Vietnam until the mid-1970s. For around 13 years, until I left Brisbane in 1968, I lived on military bases. My father was engaged in training soldiers for war. I had become anti-militarist in high school, and when I was close friends with the daughter of the secretary of the Brisbane Communist Party and her parents. I discovered much about communism in those days, but adventured even further by the early 70s towards yippies and anarchism. Yippies were the Youth International Party, a radical, youth-oriented, highly theatrical, anti-authoritarian, countercultural, revolutionary offshoot of the free speech and anti-war movements of the 1960s. I associate my books with particular events or places, and during this period, I lived in various locations: Paddington, Darlinghurst and Surrey Hills in Sydney, and Carlton in Melbourne. The poems in Shore Block were used. They turned up unsolicited in Me Jane, a women's liberation newspaper, and in magazines, and in a short film by Julie Jansen. Then several years later, in 1977, I adapted the Catalani and Little Britches poems into a short film script and made a video together with film director Gillian Lay. The video, Outlaw Queens, was screened nationally in Australia and travelled to the Venice Biennale in 1981. It was screened again in June this year at Artspace in Sydney. in a retrospective of 1970s videos, and the outlaw poems can be found online on Scribner. The Shawblock book was made when we were coming out of the psychedelic era, and my contemporaries and I willingly embraced the congeries of experimentation, sexual liberation, and societal challenges that were unfolding in the world at large. It was a time when young people experienced great feelings of possibility, spontaneity, and hope, as if anything countercultural that we imagined could be realised. Around this time, I was invited to make an artwork at the Yellow House in Macleay Street in King's Cross. The Yellow House was a radical, and you could say romantic, enterprise started by Sydney artist Martin Sharp. He said it really came out of an idea of Van Gogh's, because he called his studio the Yellow House, and he wanted to start a community of artists in the south of France, in the sunshine, to get away from the madness of Paris. Between 1970 and 1973, Sydney's Yellow House was a piece of living art and a mecca to pop art. The canvas was the house itself, and almost every wall, floor and ceiling became part of the gallery. Many well-known artists helped to create this multimedia performance art space that may have been Australia's first 24-hour-a-day happening. I made a sculpture there. In those days, in the early 1970s, many writers, publishers, filmmakers, students, actors, photographers and visual artists were active in a campaign to repeal Australia's oppressive censorship laws. In 1971, I was involved in making a publication called X, inspired graphic joy depicting explicit sexualities of all kinds. X was published by a team of radical printers and pranksters. It was a defiant gesture to state censorship and the laws used to determine obscene publications. Made in-house at Tomato Press in Glebe, using various processes like collage, screen print and potato cut, it was designed to resemble an annotated film script with stills. We called ourselves Synesthetic Press. The censorship laws were eventually changed, and that year, after intense lobbying and protesting by filmmakers, the government introduced legislation and new classifications came into effect, and R-rated films opened in cinemas around Australia. I'd already become Pamela Coca-Cola Brown. Coca-Cola was a pseudonym invented as a kind of ironic take on Andy Warhol's factory superstars. It originated at a small, heady lounge room gathering with a group of friends in our house in Surrey Hills in 1972, and it stuck for several years. In time spent in Melbourne, I'd learned silkscreen printing at a women's workshop. Back in Sydney, I worked for a small commercial business, Australian Screen Printing, where I furthered my skills and then left after a couple of months to start a venture on Glebe Point Road, Coca-Cola's silkscreen printing. I attempted to earn a living from making posters, cards, calico bags and so on. I had a screen print on demand agreement with the New Australian Rolling Stone magazine to print their t-shirts, and I wrote record reviews for them as well as for the progressive, investigative, countercultural independent newspaper, The Digger. In the evenings in our group houses, we didn't watch TV. We often sat around a table, drinking tea, smoking some hashish, and occasionally enjoying some other substances. We'd read Arthur Rimbaud. We pursued our own derangements of the senses. We made collages and drawings. In 1973, I was staying for a time in Sherbrooke in the Dandenong Mountains in Victoria, and I decided to make a book that included the work of some of my friends. This book was a reinterpreted trace of Cole's funny picture book, first published in 1879 by Edward Cole, an English entrepreneur who had migrated to Melbourne in 1852 during the gold rush, and eventually he became a bookseller. His compendium in various editions was a populous omnibus of weird and wonderful illustrations, puzzles, verses and slogans on Cole's theme of the inevitability of a federated world with one religion. It was kept in print until 1966. I did the layout for Coca-Cola's funny picture book on the kitchen table and then brought the pages in all their multicoloured splendour up to Sydney to print at Tomato Press, which was also where I'd had my silk screen shop. The book was large format, printed on coloured paper with a rainbow in the middle pages. Alongside the poems, I included lots of artwork. Not long after that, I travelled to Adelaide, thinking I might move there. But after a couple of months, enabled by a crafts grant from the new Australia Council for the Arts, I moved back to Victoria, to a town in the Dandenong Ranges called Monbulk, and set up a silkscreen printing workshop in one of the sheds that came with the house. I wrote new poems in Monbulk, and they were compiled as the small book Automatic Sad. They were more pared back than my first two publications, and I think this small book marked a change where I began to write more consciously. The poems seemed considered and less self-expressive, and possibly even unintentionally aiming for an actual reader other than friends. They seemed more in the world, in the poetry world, than the earlier writing. Some kind of transition was occurring, and it was the beginning of the use of cinematic accretion that would become a lasting aspect to my poetry writing. My next move was back to Sydney, where I gave almost all the copies of Automatic Sad to the box office people at a women's dance in lieu of paying the admission fee. They gave the books away to the dance patrons. So, because of this giveaway, it figures that this book is out of print, but it can be found online on Scribner. During this period, I lived in Adelaide, South Australia, in Poets Lane, Sherbrooke and Monbulk in the Dandenong Ranges, and in Glebe and Leichhardt in Sydney. In 1974, poet Nigel Roberts, who was incidentally originally from New Zealand, invited me to coordinate, together with him, artist Tim Burns and publisher Dave Morrissey, a package deal assembly book. It was based on the assemblage books produced in the US by Richard Kostelanetz. As the title ironically suggests, this project demonstrated, a bit like digital publishing can today, that published material can be altogether produced, distributed and controlled by the creators, independent of managerial or official structures. The catchphrase was, every contributor will be a distributor. 60 poets and artists each produced a page of a work, and we quickly screen printed some 2-colour covers on the day of collation at the Tin Sheds, which was an art workshop at Sydney University. The late poet John Forbes was still printing his contribution in the bottom shed as we were assembling the rest of the book in the middle shed. These dress the dolly images of Tim Burns' pages. There was often a kind of immediacy to pursuits in art in those days. No two copies of this book were alike. Each had original artwork, and as well as duplicated texts and graphics. 1975 was a big year. It was International Women's Year, and it was also the year that Australian troops were withdrawn from the war in Vietnam. And I became a songwriting, singing, rhythm and bass guitarist in a newly formed women's band called Clitoris Band. We performed our politically didactic, witty and heartfelt feminist songs in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane in various venues over around 18 months. In this period, I lived in Annandale and Glebe in Sydney and at St Albans in the Macdonnell Valley, 90 kilometres northwest of Sydney. In late summer in 1976, at a women's conference at Minto in southwestern Sydney, myself and 3 other women decided to form a performance group and put on some theatre in order to raise money for Elsie Women's Refuge in Glebe. Elsie's staff had been the subject of aggressive attacks on the way to and from work, and they wanted to buy walkie-talkies in order to stay in touch with each other when outside the refuge. Obviously, this was decades before the introduction of mobile or cell phones. From late 1976 and throughout 1977, our anarcho-feminist theatre group, the Lean Sisters, performed several shows with great verve. Coming from collective organisation as political strategy, it was a theatre group whose motifs were the comedy of societal monoliths. There were no sacred cows for the Leans. Images of women were positively reinterpreted, and feminist clichés were shaken up and tossed out along with other ideological power structures, the state, the church, big business, family hierarchies and so on. Throughout 1977, the Lean Sisters performed madcap political theatre to packed venues like the Tin Sheds and Bondi Pavilion. The group's members included poets, lawyers, one who has gone on to become one of Australia's High Court judges, political activists, journalists, teachers, musicians, painters, and 2 actors. We developed the scripts, sets, the entire productions collectively, which, looking back now, was an extraordinary feat. All money raised from ticket sales went to women's groups, like the initial fundraising for Elsie Women's Refuge. One show, the Poetry Water Gossip Show, involved assembling an above-ground swimming pool and a diving board in the middle shed. Every performance in that show took place in the pool. In the same year, 1977, the poetic prose writer Anna Kawani knocked on the door of my share house in Westmoreland Street, Glebe, and introduced herself. She and Ken Bolton were editing a magazine, Magic Sam, and she asked if I can contribute some poems. So that was my first encounter with Anna and Ken, and an aesthetic I was to engage with for some time to come. The New South Wales Poets Union was also formed that year. The initial meeting was exclusively male. Anna Kawani phoned me to tell me about it and asked if I would come to the second meeting. She was getting women poets to turn up to stack the meeting and introduce some policies for equality. I became a member. After the Lean Sisters Theatre Group disbanded in early 1978 in reaction against becoming normative by suggestions that we should apply for state funding, the members returned to their individual milieu. And an ex-Lean Sister poet hankered for something like the salons of Parisian women writers in the 1920s. For a short time, a few like-minded women writers met in a Lebanese coffee shop in Rozelle to share literary ideas and gossip. Then in 1978, 3 of us, poets Lee Cataldi, Joanne Burns and Anna Kawani, formed the Sydney Women Writers' Workshop. With the participation of a considerable number of contemporary women writers, it became known as the No Regrets Group and continued to meet to discuss women and writing for several years. The No Regrets Group held public readings to raise money to produce a hands-on anthology, a compendium of writing by 15 of the women involved in the group. It covers by Anna Kawani. My next book, Cafe Sport, was a collection of poems written between 1974 and 78. It was published in 1979 by Anna Kawani's Sea Cruise Books. Many of these poems were in a kind of confessional mode, which was of the times, a woman figuring out relationship in a patriarchal world. But they had a tough, punk kind of tone that probably saved them at the time from mawkishness. Rereading early poems as I scanned book covers for this talk, I was reminded how vulnerable it is to publish. It is, in a way, like developing your arts in public. Many early poems seem innocent to me now, spontaneous, youthful, with plenty to learn. Both the times and I have altered enormously. I met Tom Thompson, independent publisher of Red Press, at one of the Poets Union meetings. Not long after, Tom published a book of my prose poetry alongside Joanne Burns' prose correspondences. My then partner, Mickey Allen, an artist, and I silkscreened the titles in various colours onto her cover photo, again at the Tin Sheds. These last things happened when I lived in Glebe and Rozelle in Sydney. Of course, locality determines involvement in community or coterie, which comes kind of organically from connections made in working together. In my case, organising readings, printing, publishing, reading each other's work, and so on. I started to become closer to like minds, Ken Bolton and Sal Brereton, and other artists and poets who gathered at their house at Coalcliff on the Illawarra coast between Sydney and Wollongong. While our poems continued to contain some subjectivity, we were becoming more cognizant of the use of subjectivity in relation to earlier poetries. We shared a kind of anti-romantic position, meaning we were against the high diction, against poetry strongly dependent on metaphor and myth, and would probably say then that our bias was towards work that is modern, in the sense of its being formally self-conscious, aware of its method of working, and even exhibiting or drawing attention to its methods. So this differentiated us from poets associated with the magazines Poetry Australia and New Poetry, that we viewed as venues that valued a conventional, unchallenging formality, not new in our terms. We were reading US poets and had less European focus than the Melbourne poets around their magazines, the Ear or Etimospheres, to which we were not opposed, but our publications didn't resemble theirs. I'll quote something Robert Archambault said about the contemporary. A true contemporary is out of joint with the times, and this alienation gives a perspective from which she sees the time in ways the time does not see itself. She sees in particular the persistence of the past in the present and wishes to change or modify the present in ways that also reconfigure how we feel about the past. It's a tall order, and contemporaries are rare. I think we who shared the Coalcliff days might have hoped that we were contemporary. An exhibition documenting our work during that period was on show at Wollongong City Art Gallery for 3 weeks in April-May in 2011. There's a blog called The Coalcliff Days, and it has links to ebooks and from the exhibition. Sydney was central to a poetic boom in the 1970s. It was a movement of experimentation and poet and artist-led production of magazines, pamphlets and books. It was various and dynamic. The social connection made through tasks, in my experience, remains throughout a lifetime, although not in an unaltered manner. The internet has blurred this concept. Publication is no longer limited to or contingent on where you live, and you'll find groups becoming online mini-movements. In 1980, Mickey Allen and I moved from inner city Rozelle to Mountain Lagoon near Bilpin, a mountain apple growing area 90 kilometres west of Sydney. I was teaching Super 8 filmmaking at Sydney University's Tin Sheds art workshop and negotiating with the architecture department for the Tin Shed's first accredited courses, which came into being. Using my imprint, Never Never Books, I published Country and Eastern, a small kind of Bartesian yearning book. The poems express some loneliness, but they take a more upbeat turn towards the end. Mickey and I silkscreened the covers at the Tin Sheds. Then, in 1981, we moved to Adelaide, where I quickly found a job as assistant to the director of the Experimental Art Foundation, or EAF. I was involved there with a diversity of projects, including a very valuable residency with a group of Indigenous people from Broome in Western Australia. I worked on exhibitions, events, performance art, artist talks, film screenings, readings, and an international travelling anti-nuclear movement exhibition. I also coordinated a hands-on bookmaking project for the annual Youth Arts Festival. In 1982, I organised a 6 weeks residency at the EAF for Ken Bolton. His project was to produce 4 square format chapbooks of current poetry. He included a selection of my own poems, Small Blue View. It was a book of 6 minimal poems, one of a kind of impressionistic poem that covered the experience of living in Adelaide. Ken drew the cover images, which he and I silkscreened at artist Anne Newmarch's place. I remember that huge tree that you see on the back cover in my neighbour's yard in Parkside. It was a very big tree and unforgettable because of that. Ken and I were members of the hard-working, innovative, unfunded committee that devised the first Artists' Week for the Adelaide Festival of the Arts. After the festival, I packed up and returned to Sydney. I remember reading in Sydney that year in Polysexuality, an issue of Semiotext Journal, about a strange disease affecting homosexuals. It turned out, of course, to be the human immunodeficiency virus leading to acquired immune deficiency syndrome. I became active in writing and performing in gay and lesbian events at the Gay Community Centre in Surrey Hills and other venues, and in readings for what was then the very political annual Gay Mardi Gras. Homosexuality wasn't legalised in New South Wales until 1984. In 1982, I was invited to participate in the first Women in Arts Festival in Sydney. I gave a talk on self-publishing and did some readings, and in a 2-day workshop for women writers and artists, I demonstrated the entire process from the work on the page through the photographic and offset printing process to stapling and binding of bookmaking, resulting in 2 days in a collection called A Book of Our Own. An offshoot of the Women and Arts Festival was the formation of a cooperative publishing venture for women's writing called Redress Press. It involved dozens of women writers. In 1984, one of the first books Redress published was my own selected poems, 1971 to 82. The cover drawing, which slightly alarmed a few people, is by Mickey Allen. I think my engagement with anti-romantic, anti-poetic poetry led into a general scepticism or distrust of grand narratives in the 1980s or vice versa. The big international narratives of economic rationalist nationalists like Reagan and Thatcher influenced the entire world, including Australia. We were sceptical of grandiose explanations and big solutions to conflict like Reagan's Strategic Defence Initiative, a space-based anti-missile system. And one response for poets was montage, to deturn texts and undermine the notion of a single authoritative speaker or writer. I began collaborating with musician-composer Elizabeth Drake and sound poet Amanda Stewart to devise a performance for the Futurefall Excursions into Postmodernity conference when Jean Baudrillard visited Sydney. Our title was taken from a line by Gertrude Stein, and that is very interesting. After the conference, we continued performing it in a season at Bondi Pavilion in Sydney. This led to the formation of another group of collaborators, myself and 3 other women writers, the late Jan McCamish, Carol Christie and Amanda Stewart. Calling ourselves Generic Ghosts, we compiled montage pieces, first as an intervention into the linearity of academic papers given at a cultural conference at the University of Technology in Sydney in '86. And these montages were the work of many writers and were constructed especially for public reading. They were a response to the writer as authoritative voice, to the language of threat and terrorism, and to the notions that feminist or women's writing be concerned only with the I and the other. The work was compiled from clippings from various texts brought to the table by each participant and group assembled. We performed them at conferences and later at Writers in the Park, at the Harold Park Hotel and at the Performance Space. One of these, The Return of the Deadeye, or Modes of Goo, was published by Fab Press in the anthology Writers in the Park. In this period, I lived in Newtown and Petersham, and I also travelled overseas for the first time for a couple of months in Italy and France. 1988 was the year celebrating the bicentenary of James Cook's arrival in Australia and of the subsequent 200 years of white settlement. Since 1938, Australia Day had been known as the Day of Mourning. In 1988, it became Invasion Day. That year, as a protest against continuing Aboriginal disadvantage, I'll get to that in a minute. I'll just say that instead of frolicking on Sydney Harbour in amongst the First Fleet reenactment on January the 26th, which was Australia Day, I joined with more than 40,000 people, including Aborigines from across the country, in the largest protest movement march that Sydney had seen since the 1970s moratorium demonstrations. We marched through Sydney chanting for land rights and ended at Hyde Park, where several prominent Aboriginal leaders and activists spoke about the continuing struggle for rights and recognition. Anyway, in that year, as a protest against the continuing disadvantage during that year, the Indigenous poet Kath Walker returned her 1970 award, Member of the British Empire, and subsequently adopted her Nunukal tribal name, Oodgeroo, meaning paperbark. And her friend, the great progressive poet Judith Wright, boycotted the 1988 bicentennial celebrations. For my part, apart from demonstrating, I refused participation in bicentennial readings and anthologies like The Tin Wash Dish, Poems from Today's Australians. The title is from a poem by Les Murray, which was a conservative selection of poems representing a white perspective. It was edited by John Tranter for the Australian Broadcasting Commission as one of their contributions to the bicentennial. I added a disclaimer to my book of poetic prose, Keep It Quiet, produced by Anna Kawani's Sea Cruise Books in 1987, but published in early 1988. The cover drawing is by the late Melbourne artist Sue Ford. In the same year, Jan McCamish and I continued our montage process and wrote As Much Trouble as Talking, a performance text which played for a 3-week season at Belvoir Street Theatre in Sydney. It was later edited for radio broadcast on the ABC's Listening Room. Then Jan and I landed a 3-month playwriting residency at the Performance Space in 1989, where we experimented with more texts for performance. By 1990, my selected poems 1971-82 was out of print, so Pat Woolley, a co-founder of Redress Press and director of Wild and Woolly Publishing, decided to publish an updated selection, New and Selected Poems. The cover painting is by Jan Mackay, a Sydney artist who also designed the poster for As Much Trouble as Talking. And during this period, I lived in Petersham, Camperdown and Leichhardt in Sydney. In 1994, the University of Queensland Press published my collection This World, This Place. These poems included my responses to some foreign trips to Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Besozzo and other places in Italy. And in the final poems, especially one called Flickering Gardi, my poetry writing took a distinctly different direction from anything I'd written up to then. A new kind of abstraction began for me. I took the cover photo of this book in the lane behind our place in Camperdown, and Kent Whitmore designed it. On the advice of the UQP editor, Sue Abbey, I'd cut some poems from the manuscript. I published them as a supplement called Little Droppings and dedicated it to Sue Abbey. 3 years later, in 1997, Little Esther Books published 50/50, a collection of around 30 restless poems. The title was intended to suggest that the poet and the reader would go 50/50 on the poems, that in turn might have a 50/50 chance of working out, just like the androgynous River Phoenix and Keanu Reeves sharing a delirious cigarette on the cover. The poems had the usual roots in politics, honed in the ironies or paradoxes of Australia's geopolitical situation. In 1988, poet John Kinsella, who was teaching Australian poetry at Cambridge University, published alongside others a chapbook of my poems, where in one I describe writing a poem as a shambling contingency. John distributed them in the UK to his students and other poets. His imprint, Folio Salt, for this project was later to become the well-known international publisher Salt. Also in 1988, after he published my review of the Oxford University Press Anthology of New Zealand Poetry in English, the editor Ian Sison asked me to join the progressive literary journal Overland as the poetry editor. I continued in that role for 5 years until 2002. It was a task I relished. The millennium turned without mishap. Around that time, a small poetry press with lofty ideals was started up by some Sydney University English department students. They began publishing fine art chapbooks as Vagabond Press. A group of 4 poems of mine was published, Drifting Topoi. I also guest edited a series of 4 chapbooks for Vagabond that year, introducing the work of young poets like former Yugoslavia-born Lydia Cvetkovic, whose poetry I'd encountered at Overland magazine, and the young Indigenous poet from Brisbane, Samuel Wagan Watson. In the year 2000, my partner Jane Zamiro and I fled the Sydney Olympics for the Indian Ocean Islands, Mauritius and La Réunion. The following year, we travelled to Berlin, Hawaii, Montreal, Quebec, and later, after Berlin, we stayed for a time in France. On the way up to Canada, I wanted to stop in Hawaii to meet an internet cohort, the poet, academic and publisher Susan Schultz. I wrote some poems on these trips. I first came across the term 747 poem in a chapbook by Rob Wilson that Susan's Tinfish Press published called Pacific Postmodern. The term denotes an impressionistic fly-in, fly-out view of the world. Later, Randolph Healy, an Irish poet and publisher of Wild Honey Press, made the chapbook 1147 Poems. And in 2002, Susan Schultz and I were invited to set up a department in the online site International Corporation for Lost Structures. We became job share archivists in our newly created Department of Dislocated Memory. As the USA and Australia were embarking on the second invasion of Iraq and later a war in Afghanistan, we began to compile a collaborative poem and prose poem examining war, power, and the effects on the everydayness of most people's lives. The effects of war and power on most people's lives. It was called Amnesiac Recoveries. In the same year, Little Esther Books published my next collection of poems, Text Thing. It became my favourite work of all my books thus far. It seemed to be a consolidation of recent work, and among other things, the poems canvassed post-coloniality and reflected on the position of a kind of thinking tourists. The cover photo of the beachside graffiti on the Besser brick, while you are reading, is by Kurt Brereton. My next collection that same year was compiled as a new and selected poems with a Northern Hemisphere audience in mind. I think it's still a good introduction to all the other books I've been showing you up to that date. Dear Deliria was published in the UK by Salt. The cover image is a detail from a painting by John Catapan, a Melbourne-based artist, and that was the beginning of our continuing collaboration. In 2004, John Tranter asked me to join him in editing the influential international online journal Jacket. Thus began the most email correspondence I've ever conducted in my life with some of the most fascinating poetry people. In 2005, the independent student press I mentioned earlier published the chapbook Let's Get Lost. I'd spent 6 months living in a poet's flat in Rome in 2003. Ken Bolton had stayed there in an earlier year. Let's Get Lost comprises poems exchanged between myself, Ken, and our mutual friend Laurie Duggan during that period. The result is an agendaless mulling over places and cultures. It's often in shorthand, casual, and is sometimes intensely specific. And as Fran Dado said, it's funny, memorable, accurate. So in those years I lived in Bellevue Hill and Rose Bay in Sydney with visits to a Blackheath weekender and a half-year stint in Rome, Italy. Using my imprint Never Never Books, I published limited editions of 2 chapbooks in 2006, Peel Me as a Bibbo, its subtitle was 5 Poems for Friends, and a reissue of the chapbook John Kinsella had published in Cambridge, My Lightweight Intentions, with a new cover, a photo that I took in the graffiti tunnel at Sydney University. Also in 2006, a collaboration between the Seattle-based Egyptian poet Maged Zaya and myself came about due to the absence of a poem. Maged had sent me a submission to Jacket magazine, but he forgot to attach the poem, and he said to atone for this, he proposed a collaboration between us. I don't know about the atonement bit, but that's what he said. And this collaboration lasted for a year and a half and became the poems that Susan Schultz's Tin Fish Press published in the chapbook Far Out Library Software. The collaboration process was smooth, the poems seemed seamless. I still can't tell whose writing is whose. Among the poems' topics are change, constant change of jobs, friends, cities, and of course the software with which we mark time's passing. The cover is by Che Ho Lee. Nicholas Pounder, Sydney book poet and bookseller and publisher at Polar Bear Press, surprised me by publishing a fine art broadsheet of the poem Train Train in 2007 in a limited edition of 26 signed copies lettered A to Z. The poem was to be the final one in my next book, True Thoughts. These poems were written between 2002 and 2007 in that period of global instability and military eruption. Even so, they were anchored in the everyday, moderated by a self-conscious slant, and moved through many realms, both actual and metaphysical. And that useful quality, irony, affected a sense of the ludicrous in the face of mortality. These poems attempted to fathom the question, how to live, and the larger one, alongside it, how to live now. When I was a silkscreen printer, I used to enjoy thinking up slogans to print on T-shirts. I am a humorless feminist was one of my big successes. I'm so shallow I'm stranded and I'm so deep I'm drowning were 2 that had moderate success. And no, I'm not Dora Carrington was almost a total failure, except for its use by a Bloomsbury enthusiast who wore it until it faded and thinned and eventually became a cleaning rag. I stopped making screen-printed T-shirts before I had the chance to use my favourite, a T-shirt that could be worn anywhere on the planet, bearing 2 words, authentic local. Several decades later, in 2010, a collection of my poems was published by Paper Tiger with the title Authentic Local. 2 lines open the book: authentic locals, anywhere and everywhere. The word authentic to me means that a person's not being manipulated or alienated from their context or surrounding values. So authenticity can vary, and it can be peripatetic, in the sense of authenticity lending value to a place, a person, an object, and so on. My use of it was intended as ironic, and I'd like to reflect a little here on irony, using a borrowed question. Is irony always supercilious? Irony can be seen as being politically paralysing because it points out problems rather than seeking solutions to them. US poet Bob Perelman said to fellow poet Ray Armantrout, "Irony seems to helplessly laugh at the unredeemed social world and pick it apart to show its inadequacies without showing any way to transcend them." It's that word helplessly that secures its use for me, and I'm not sure I'd seek transcendence over problems. Ray Armantrout responded, "It's probably elitist as well as unrealistic to think art can point out solutions. Art is the play of resonance and dissonance. To the extent that it can foreground social dissonances, it can serve a political end by increasing people's discomfort." Also, in 2010, Jessie Glass from Ahadada Books in Japan offered me the opportunity to publish some poems as an e-book. So we made the Met of Zzz. I think some of Lisa's students here in Auckland read it earlier this year or last year. The obvious advantage of an e-book is that it's always available on the web, and this one is also free. In this period, I lived in Rose Bay and Chinatown in Sydney, Elwood and St Kilda in Melbourne, and Lura and Blackheath in the Blue Mountains. In 2010, John Tranter retired from Jacket, and he arranged for the magazine to move to Philadelphia to the University of Pennsylvania to become Jacket 2. In the following year, I was no longer involved on a daily basis, and my inbox gradually reduced its bulging weight. When he heard that Jacket was going to change, Bob Arnold of Longhouse Publishing in Vermont, in the US, emailed to say that he'd like to publish a broadsheet of some of my poems in thanks for publishing his work in Jacket. Needless to say, I was very pleased by this gesture. Bob made the small folded broadsheet of 7 poems sentimental in 2010. In 2011, another chapbook offer came my way. Rob Reel's Picaro Press wanted to publish a selection of my poems in his Wagtail series. It's called In My Phone. Rob was generous in offering to publish my poems, as we don't really share an aesthetic or similar outlook. I stayed on at Jacket 2 as an associate, and last year, because I knew that the new editors were going to publish mostly theoretical work and that their bias would be inevitably more North American than mine and John's had been, I thought it was important to include some actual poetry from the arse end of the world, as Paul Keating once memorably called Australia. So I edited a feature of 51 Australian poets and several artists. In this period, I lived in Haymarket, Chinatown and Annandale, and finally Alexandria, where I still live and intend to stay put. 2012 saw the publication of a couple of chapbooks. Any World is a pocket-sized selection of poems from various earlier publications published by Kit Kellen's Macau-based press, Flying Islands. And More Than a Feuilleton is a small book of 6 poems published by Ken Bolton's Little Esther Books. I'll just explain the title. A contemporary example of a feuilleton might be the Talk of the Town section of the New Yorker magazine, say, or in English newspapers the term feuilleton referred to an instalment of a serial story. In contemporary French, a feuilleton is a soap opera on TV or a radio serial. But I intend my use of feuilleton to have the quality of the original French meaning, which was saying true things in half a page or less. And as the poem is discursive, it's more than a feuilleton. The booklet includes a poem called Worldless, which I'd also like to extrapolate on a little, and I hope it doesn't seem too highfalutin. Just over a decade ago, in 2002, As she took stock of the end of the 20th century, feminist literary theorist Julia Kristeva worried about the helplessness that I mentioned earlier. She observed, "We live in a time in which civilization is on the brink of collapse. There are many signs of this collapse of the symbolic function: mass suicide," I think she meant Jonestown or Waco, "drug addiction, unemployment, social marginalisation, as well as the empire of images and the destruction of the family." A function that human beings fostered during thousands of years, the internalisation of prohibitions in the form of a superego or an ideal ego, is being destroyed, and psychic space is adrift, lost in a state of delirium. Others have said that we live in a social space which is increasingly experienced as worldless. In such a space, the only form protest can take is meaningless violence, like, say, the London riots of 2011. Perhaps this is one of the main dangers of capitalism. Although by virtue of being global, it encompasses the whole world. It sustains a worldless ideological constellation in which people are deprived of their ways of locating meaning. So referring back to that notion of helplessness, I wanted very little to happen in a poem that I called Worldless. I wanted, if I could write it, to somehow epitomise an everyday sense of worldlessness. And once again, I employed a kind of cinematic accretion, and I hoped it was a mechanism that didn't foreground a rationale or agenda. The poem ends without strong fanfare or conclusion, and it's published in my recent book, Home by Dark. In March this year, this collection of kinetic, fragmentary, yet often discursive, mostly agenda-free poems, including Worldless, that I wrote from around 2008 until late last year, was published by Tony Fraser Shearsman's Books in the UK. It's currently travelling through the poetry realm and other zones, looking for its shelves. The cover detail is once again by John Catapan. I'm not sure I've made any points about movement as a modus operandi, or about being a varietal local, or poetry's social and political function, but I do know that here, looking east into Oceania, I'm definitely a foreign bystander with many doubts about the relevance of what I've just presented as my life in books and booklets. Thank you.